Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So I just want to consider a relatively simple and brief topic, something that I've touched on in plenty of previous videos, and that is cold steel weapons in the modern age and the industrial age. Now, what prompted these thoughts were that I was just cleaning off this 1900 pattern British Royal Navy cutlass, and I thought to myself, you know, it's incredible. I've got another cutlass here, in fact. Just grab this one for a second. So this is an 1845 Pattern Cutlass, and if we go back to 1845, then in sense that if it looks a funny colour, it's because it's covered in grease. I have yet to clean it. These have just arrived. But in 1845, lots of things were changing in the military world. Firearms were developing quickly. Artillery was developing quickly. Ships were developing quickly. So that between 1845 and say 1865, enormous changes had happened. You know, things like railways were starting to be a factor in warfare, ironclad ships, breech loading, long range guns mounted in ships and used on land as well. The conversion from muskets to rifles, in fact the introduction of breech loading rifles, the introduction of metallic cartridges, huge numbers of changes between 1845 and 1865. So we're talking about sort of the Sikh Wars period, or the kind of before the Crimean War, through the Crimean War, and then to the US Civil War. So a huge number of changes, and yet one thing which remained the same was the fact that cold steel weapons were still around. They were still being developed, and that's really what I want to talk about here, and they were still being used to some extent. Now, if I put the 1845 back down, so coming back to the to the 1900 model cutlass, what prompted this thought was the fact that it's quite incredible that they had cutlasses like the 1845 and the ones that came after it. They had those cutlasses around, and this is true of any country, this doesn't just relate to Britain. And they had the existing bayonets and they had the existing cavalry swords, and yet even still they still kept developing these new models of cold steel weapons. And why? So one of the things that I often encounter when I'm talking about the use of these weapons are the firearms fans basically going, oh, well, these were just all irrelevant because everyone was shooting each other by this point. Now, there's some truth to that, and there's also some misconceptions to that. And I should point out, as you guys know, I shoot historical firearms. I shoot World War I rifle, I shoot lever action Winchester, muzzle loaders, revolvers, shotguns, all sorts of things. So I shoot historical firearms, and I like firearms, and I'm interested in firearms, and I read about firearms, and I watch Forgotten Weapons, and I watch Cap and Ball. I watch all of those channels out there that deal with historical firearms, just in the same way that most of the time I deal with historical hand weapons. And yes, at some point I do hope to collaborate with some of those people. I've already done some light touch stuff with British muzzle loaders. So the question comes up, why were cold steel weapons still being developed and still being issued in the age of, should we say, modern firearms, breech loading, particularly once we get into magazine rifles and this kind of stuff? And the simple fact is that cold steel weapons still had a place on the battlefield. As I've spoken about many times in the past, often I use World War I as an example, and then people come back with the statistical debate, the fact that they say, oh, well, statistically, less than 1% of people killed in World War I were actually killed with hand weapons. Yep, that's true. However, actually something like only 1 in 10 of people who were actually engaged in World War I actually died in World War I. So the statistics instantly get strange there. So actually, contrary to popular belief, in any war, in any period of history, really, the number of people engaged in the whole conflict, usually it's a relative minority who are actually casualties of that war in terms of actually dying. And then, of course, if we look at World War I, we also get into, well, the biggest killers were things like shelling and, you know, shrapnel wounds, accidents, and exposure, disease, things like this as well. So, and that's true of any war as well. these kind of accidental things and disease and, you know, exposure to cold or the weather. This is all lack of water, lack of clean water, diseases like cholera and things like that. These have always been the main killers. So let's ignore the statistics for a minute. The question is, why did they keep developing and issuing cold steel weapons as late as the end of the 19th century and into the First World War? In fact, through the 20th century as well, we still have bayonets today, and I know not all countries really train with bayonets, not all countries even issue bayonets all the time, but we still, in many countries of the world, certainly in Britain, we still have bayonets and they are still issued. So the question is why? But the point is that in the year 1900, or indeed in World War I, there was the expectation that they would get used. And this is, I think, a point that often gets overlooked in this discussion. People look purely at casualty rates and things like this, and they're very hard and fast. But actually, that's kind of irrelevant. If you look at the training that was done in the lead up to World War I and during World War I, there was a huge emphasis on training cavalrymen how to use their swords and lances and training infantrymen how to use their bayonets. How much they actually used those weapons is a whole nother point. Let's just package that away and put that away for a second. The fact is that they expected to use them. And this is, and they were prepared to use them, and they trained to use them. And this isn't a brush away irrelevant point. This is actually very, very important. And it's true of any period of history. We don't statistically really know how many people in an average medieval battle were actually killed by swords. What we do approximately know for some medieval battles, for example, is roughly how many casualties there were in proportion to the number of combatants. And actually, usually it's relatively small. Most medieval battles saw a relatively small percentage of the total number of people engaged in it die. Obviously, a greater number were wounded and didn't die, or at least didn't die in the short term. They might die of disease sometime later. And then the losing side, the majority of the losing side survived, but ran away. And they ran away to fight another day. And that's why wars went on for a period of time, because of course your soldiers go, this battle's going badly, they start to rout, they run away, most of them get away, and then at some later point, you regather your forces, you get them back together again, you maybe get some fresh recruits in as well, you restock, resupply, and you go in for the next campaign. So it's not that the population of soldiers is just wiped out. You know, that doesn't generally happen. And when it does happen, you know, rare battles like the Battle of Towton, where a lot of people were slaughtered, or the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold Hardrada's army seems to be, from the sources, more or less wiped out. That's very unusual, and that's usually mentioned. That's an unusual thing, and it's mentioned in the sources. So coming back to the 19th and 20th centuries, these weapons, regardless of how much they were used in any single encounter, there was an expectation that they might be used and they might be useful. And as I mentioned in my World War I video not that long ago, with bayonets, a weapon doesn't have to kill lots of people to be useful. Its presence on the battlefield is a useful tactical thing. If you know that there are some lancers on that hill over there, then you're not going to form into line to face the enemy. You're going to stay in square, and staying in square makes you more vulnerable to the enemy artillery. So that group of lancers on that hill, they're not using their lancers to kill you, but their lances are the factor that mean that you're staying in square and losing more of your men to the artillery fire from over there. So it's kind of rock, paper, scissors. It's this use of weapons on the battlefield, the threat of them. And we know in World War I, there are documented cases of people going in at bayonet point into a trench and capturing the trench. How many people did they kill with their bayonets? Not many. They threw some hand grenades in, they shot some, they jumped in, maybe bayoneted a couple, and the others ran away. Partially because they've got their bayonets on. They went in at bayonet point. The bayonet doesn't have to be used in order to capture the trench. And what's the important tactical objective? Is to capture the trench and hold it. And you can only do that if you have the ability to fight at point blank range and take the fight to the enemy. And that's why cold steel weapons are still, one of the reasons why cold steel weapons are still issued in the military today. because you put your bayonet on the front of your SA-80 or whatever rifle you're using, and you take ground and you hold ground with it. If some insurgents with rocks and sticks come at you, well, they're not going to necessarily close with you because you've got bayonets on there. So the bayonets have many, many different roles. Cold steel weapons have many, many different roles that perform a goal on the battlefield or in any engagement, small or large, that is beyond just killing people. I think I've made that point before. So the question comes back, and I want to reiterate this point. Why were cold steel weapons still being developed to be effective as well, not just developed for the heck of it? As I say, they've already got these cutlasses, lances, sabres in circulation. They don't need to make new ones. They can just keep making the same one. But right the way up, even until World War I and beyond World War I in some countries, if we look at Poland, for example, with cavalry sabres, into the 30s. So we're well into the 20th century, we see cold steel weapons still being developed, still being made, still being issued. And the reason is because there is an expectation that they may be needed. Finally, I want to end up on one point, and that is, just because something is not generally used or generally needed, for example, bayonets in the modern world, there are always exceptions. And, famously, for example, bayonets were fixed and there was a bayonet charge in Iraq, and it achieved an objective, and that was extremely unusual. It gained ground, it took ground, it drove the enemy away. So it achieved the objective perfectly, in fact. And those exceptions are actually incredibly important, because what you don't want for your soldiers, for your army, your military or navy, is for them to every now and again, one time in 100, to need something and not have it. It is better to have the thing and not need it than to need it and not have it. Your sailors might have cutlasses, and it might be decades that go by and they never use their cutlasses. And then there's that one occasion where the enemy try and storm your ship, and the fact that they've got cutlasses mean that they drive the enemy off and they save the ship. And that one exception, that one occasion, is incredibly important to influencing what happens after. And of course, that is also one of the reasons that these weapons continued being developed and continued being issued, because you don't want to be the one military in the world that said, we don't need cutlasses anymore, and then you get stormed by a bunch of pirates while you're cruising the Indian Ocean and taken out because you've got some revolvers, you run out of ammunition, and you don't have any hand weapons to defend the ship with. You don't want to be the exception. So as I say, it's better to have something and not need it than need it and not have it. And so for that reason, and all of the other reasons I've outlined here, and some more reasons as well which I haven't mentioned, cold steel weapons were still important at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and are still being developed and issued and used very occasionally in the modern world as well. And with bayonets, obviously they have a secondary purpose as just a general purpose knife in some cases, opening tin cans, all this kind of stuff. But with things like cutlasses, naval cutlasses were still being issued into the Second World War. And there are records from the Second World War of people actually wearing these or drawing cutlasses in order to board enemy vessels and capture them officially. So even at that point, even with submachine guns and everything else that was available to them, they still thought, may as well have a cutlass, because why not? Anyway, I hope this has been a little bit thought-provoking. Share your thoughts below, give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you really soon for another video on Scholar Gladiatorial channel. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.